Hello, and in today's lesson we're going to look at factorising quadratics into double brackets. And we're going to use something called the Xbox method, which a number of you have seen before, you've told me in the past, but this might be new to quite a few of you. So we're going to start by looking at quadratics where we have just one x squared. But we first need to talk a little bit about a general quadratic. So what you can see on the screen here, ax squared plus bx plus c, this is a general quadratic. So we call the number in front of x squared a, the number in front of the x part b, and then the constant at the end c. So this will just be a number at the end here. And for the time being, we're going to look at quadratics where a is just equal to 1. So when you're setting up the Xbox, this here is the x, and we put in this top bit here the number in front of the x squared multiplied by the constant, so a multiplied by c, and then in the bottom part of the Xbox, we put the value that's in front of the x, the b, here down in the bottom of the x. And then we're looking for two numbers which go in the left and the right hand side of the x that will multiply to give us the value here and add to give us the value here. So this will make more sense when you see an actual example. And then the box part of the Xbox is the grid that we've been using to expand double brackets. And we know that always when we expand those double brackets, here is where we get the number of x squareds we've got, and here is where we get the constant. And what the Xbox tells us, this here is the coefficient of the x in this part, and this here is the coefficient of the x in this part. So that might sound like a little bit of gobbledygook to start with, but we're going to look at an example and then you'll start to see how this works. So in the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see all the stuff that we just talked about. So this is the quadratic that we're going to factorise, x squared plus 4x plus 3. And so in the top here, remember, goes a times c. So a in this case is 1, c is positive 3. So we're going to do 1 times by 3, which is just 3. And in this bottom part of the Xbox, we're going to put the number in front of the x here. Now, if it was negative, we would need to include that as well, but it is just a positive 4, so we're going to put 4 down there. So what we're looking for here are two numbers that will multiply to make 3, but add to make 4. So one way that you can approach this, if it's not immediately obvious, is to think about all your factor pairs for 3, and then pick ones which will add to make 4. Now 3 is a prime number, so there is only one factor pair, and it's 1 multiplied by 3. And as it happens, that adds to make 4. So those are the choices we need to make. So 1 and 3, they're the only choices in this case, and it happens to be correct. So now I'm going to concentrate on filling in my box. I've done the x part, now I need to do the box. So whenever I expand double brackets here, I will get the x squared part. So in here, I know I've got to have an x squared. And in here, I will always multiply my two numbers together to get my number here. So that is always going to be this part. And what this is telling me is what I need to have, how many x's I need to have here and here. So I know I need 1x, so I've just written x, and here I need 3x. So that's what these are, they're the coefficients of the x's. Now what I do is I think about the factors of both of the columns and both of the rows. So first of all, my common factor of x squared and 3x, the only thing that's a factor of both of those is x. And the only thing that's a factor of x squared and x is x. And now I know it has to be x and x anyway, because these two have got to multiply to be x squared. So moving on then, the only number, the only thing that will divide into x and 3 is 1. So I know this has got to be positive 1. And then what will divide into 3x and 3? Well, the common factor there is positive 3. And so this tells me what my two brackets need to be. So x squared add 4x add 3, is equal to x add 1 multiplied by x add 3. And it's always useful to check that you're correct by just expanding that bracket back again and checking that you get back to where you started. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. So again, a times c, well, this is just 1 again, so it's going to be 1 times 10, which is 10. And then here I have an 11, and it's a positive 11, so positive 11 is going into the bottom. Now you may say, well, why don't you just say that this is c every time? And that's because we will look at examples where we don't have a 1 here, so we always need to remember that it is a times c and not just this number on its own. So now I'm looking for two numbers that will multiply to make 10 and add to make 11. So again, if I think about my factor pairs for 10, I've got 1 and 10, 2 and 5. Now 2 and 5 is not going to work. That would make 7. So it must be 1 and 10, and they will add to make 11. So now I can fill in my box. I know that I'm going to have my x squared part here, and I know I'm going to have my positive 10 part here. And so this is now telling me what the coefficients of my x terms are going to be. So I'm going to have 1x and 10x there. And now I'm going to look for my common factors. So what's the common factor of x squared and 10x? Well, that's x. And what's the common factor of x squared and x? Well, that's x too. And anyway, I know it has to be x times x to make x squared. It's the only option. What is the common factor of x and 10? Well, the only thing that will divide into both is positive 1. And what's the common factor of these two? Well, that's got to be positive 10. So my two brackets are x add 1 multiplied by x add 10. Okay, this example is a little different because we've now got a subtract 12x. So far we've only looked at positives. But we're going to start off the same. So in the top here, we've got 1 times by 20, and that's going to give me 20. And then here, I've got to have the whole of b, and that includes its sign. So that's got to be negative 12. So I'm now looking for two numbers that will multiply to make 20, but add to make negative 12. So I'm going to go through my factor pairs for 20. I've got 1 and 20. 2 and 10, 4 and 5. So 2 and 10 is interesting because I know I can make a 12 out of that. The problem is that it's got to be a negative 12. So if I'm going to add 2 and 10 to make negative 12, well, they're going to have to be negative 2 and negative 10. And that works because when I multiply these together, because they're both negative, I will get a positive 20. So now I can fill in my box. So I'm going to have x squared and positive 20. And then here I know I'm going to get negative 2x and negative 10x. And now I can think about my common factors. So common factor of x squared and negative 10x is x. Common factor of x squared and negative 2x is x. And then my common factors here are interesting. Whatever number I've got here and whatever number I've got here, they're both going to need to be negative because if they're not, they won't multiply to give me a positive. So common factor here will be 2, but actually it's going to have to be negative 2. And the common factor here is 10, but actually it's going to need to be negative 10 because otherwise they won't multiply to make positive 20. Now at this point you might say, well, hang on, this and this is always the same as these two, and you'd be right, but only for these examples where we've got the value in front of x squared is 1. So I'm sort of talking you through the whole process, even though there are a few shortcuts for these versions, because you are later going to have to do more difficult versions of this factorising. But for the moment, our two brackets are x minus 2 multiplied by x minus 10. And again, you could check that by expanding those two brackets. Okay, next example. Again, a little bit different because I've got two negatives here. But first of all, I've got A is 1, C is negative 35. So 1 times negative 35 is negative 35. And then B here is negative 2. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to make negative 35 and add to make negative 2. Now, if two numbers are going to multiply to make a negative, well, they can't both be negative and they can't both be positive. So one of them is going to have to be negative. So I'm going to go through my factor pairs for 35. I'm going to have 1 and 35, and then I'm going to have 7 and 5. So 7 and 5 seems interesting because there's a difference of 2 there. And so I can probably make a 2, but the only way I can make a negative 2 when I add is if it's negative 7 and positive 5, because when I add those two things together, that will give me negative 2. So you have to think carefully about when you multiply, how are you going to get these signs? If this is positive, then they either both have to be positive or both negative. Whereas if this is negative, they have to have one negative and one positive. And then from that, you can work out which one will give you the negative or positive value that you need here. So filling in my x box then, I'm going to have x squared and negative 35, and then negative 7x and positive 5x. So here, common factor here is x, and common factor here is x. Common factor here, well, they're both divisible by negative 7, and here they're both divisible by 5, not negative 5, because this isn't negative. So positive 5, and that tells me that my brackets are x subtract 7 multiplied by x add 5. Okay, so this one is interesting because there is no x term involved here. So this is A is 1 and C is negative 16. There is no x, so B is 0. So I'm going to fill in my x like this. I'm going to have negative 16 because 1 times negative 16 is negative 16. And then B is 0. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to make negative 16, but add to make 0. So factor pairs of 16, I've got 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4. Now 4 and 4 seems interesting. They've got a difference of 0, and if I multiply them to make negative 16, one of them will have to be negative. So negative 4 and 4, if I add those, that will give me 0. So now filling in my box, I'm going to have x squared and negative 16. And then I'm going to have negative 4x and positive 4x, which will add to make 0. Common factors here then are x and x again. And then the common factor here is negative 4. The common factor here is positive 4. And so this will factorise to be x subtract 4 multiplied by x add 4. Now this type of quadratic is called the difference of two squares, because to make this work, you've got an x squared and you've also got a square number here that you're subtracting. So difference, you're subtracting. It wouldn't work if we were adding. And that will always factorise so that you've got x subtract the square root of the number multiplied by x add the square root of the number. If you forget that though, your x box will always work provided you remember that b here is 0. Okay, so that's all quite tricky, and for some of you it might be quite new. So here are some examples for you to have a go at. These are the easiest versions because they are all positive, and then we start to get into situations where you've got some negative terms there. Keep your eye out for any that are the difference of two squares. And so what you're going to need to do here is pause the video so that you can give these a go.